So basically, quick thing about myself. My name is Nalini Saul. I've been at UCSF for 20 years. I had an office called the Office of Career and Professional Development. Basically, we work with graduate students and postdoctoral scholars, mostly, and then a little bit with faculty, to really sort of think about sort of how to engage in this professional space. One of the projects that I have is that I'm co-PI on a National Science Foundation grant with our colleagues at City College. And we are basically trying to figure out where we have a mentorship program, and we're trying to figure out, why do mentorship relationships fail? Because if you're going to basically kind of figure out sort of like how to navigate them, you have to really have a sense of what the pitfalls are. Because one of the big pitfalls that we are seeing is that we have mentors who are like excited. They're like, I'm here for this. I wish I had this. I want this to happen. And then we have mentees who are like, yes, I really want to mentor. And then they get together and then something happens where the relationship isn't optimal. And so one of the first things that we do in our training is that we sort of have parallel training for our mentors and mentees. And in this case, I'm going to try to truncate this, and you're just going to kind of all go through it together. In that our goal for mentees is that they have the ability to walk into any environment, sort of like, as nurses, you can walk into any patient's room and you have a sense of what you need to assess. There's an understanding that when you actually are talking about engaging in a professional relationship, there are these key factors you also need to assess. So our goal is to help a mentee actually assess sort of how effective a relationship is, or sort of like how to make this relationship functional, and to identify red flags and to seek out for help. And then for mentors, particularly historically excluded, historically underrepresented mentors, we want to actually give them the skills, not necessarily to mentor, because usually that all of you have been in mentorship relationships. It's understanding how not to burn out. And so by engaging in this parallel sort of training and having them work together, hopefully we get to sort of a good outcome, which both the mentee and the mentor has sort of like a fundamental, even theoretical understanding about what's supposed to be happening in the relationship. And we're going to talk a little bit about why. So because of that, know that usually all of our sessions are interactive. So you will be chatting today, and you'll be going into breakout rooms, and you'll be reflecting on your experiences, because that also helps kind of build sort of a community picture of what people's experiences are. So there are kind of three things that we just need to kind of cover just as this first opening, which is to understand a little bit about why mentorship relationships go wrong even when both sides have like the best of intentions. And this is, I'll just sort of say, it's really interesting because usually for mentors or people who are experienced as mentors, they're like, oh, that's what that is. That's a role conflict. And so part of this is about sort of you hopefully reflecting on your experiences that you've had and putting it in context, right? And putting it in the theory. And then there's the second thing about sort of just understanding the cycle, the life cycle of a mentoring relationship. And then there's this third thing about having some clarity about your goals, your boundaries, and your preferences. So this is where we're going to start today. And we're going to hopefully have a really engaging conversation. So the first thing that I just need to explain that most people sort of don't necessarily recognize, but sort of intuitively you might understand, is that there's a life cycle to every single professional relationship you're in. And it really sort of has 5 stages, and you have to kind of understand what those stages are. The first stage is this process for a mentor or a mentee, where it's kind of like a mentor or mentee basically sort of identifies something like, I have a goal and I would like some support, so I would like to find a mentor. Or a mentor sort of thinks, I'd like to give back, and so I need to, I'd love to reach out and sort of find like a mentee. So the first sort of stage is this identification. And then there's kind of like the initial connection, which is that you either formally or you informally. And so when it's informal, it's just kind of like, hey, can I come by and sort of ask you some questions? And the mentor's like, yeah. And then suddenly, without knowing it, they're like, boom, we're in a mentoring relationship. So the second stage is sort of like this connection where they start actually engaging in those activities that could be defined as a mentor or a protege. The third stage is actually, let me move this, is this idea, and this is where it's a little tricky for people, is that there's this stage, and this is where all of you are right now, which is that establishing sort of like the scope of your relationship, both goals, your forms of engagement, and also sort of starting to articulate needs and preferences, particularly work style preferences. Then you hopefully have that relationship. you're giving feedback, you're receiving feedback, you're recognizing progress, you're accepting or offering support, right? And the relationship continues until the relationship ends. Now, sometimes the relationship ends because the person met their goal or their goal has changed, but one of the things that we're finding, particularly with the ending of a relationship, is that people aren't necessarily sure sort of how to do it and what the professional etiquette is about it. But then and then hopefully that person, that mentee or that mentor sort of comes to a new goal, and then they go through the cycle again. And so this is the entire sort of cycle. That's sort of like the first thing that you just need to understand, like, how does this loop work? Because once you understand that, you can actually start to figure out, like, where does the loop begin to fall apart? And in general, what we have found through our research is that the loop falls apart here. Oh, actually, let's go back. The loop falls apart starts to fall apart around the establishing the relationship. And it falls apart in two ways. What ends up happening is that neither side is particularly clear about all the things that need to happen in terms of sort of the exchange of information. And usually what ends up happening is that we find that when people have an affinity towards each other, so I'm an African-American, if my mentor was African-American, I would think, well, you know what, we'll just figure it out as we go along. So I have trust that we're going to work this relationship out. But when there's a difference, sometimes people actually have issues around safety and they don't want to appear as if they don't know. And so they don't actually try to sort of figure out kind of like what the scope of the relationship is. But the point is that what we're finding is that at this third part, where this number 3, which is really understanding what does it mean to establish the relationship, which is sort of like the first 10% of your time and interaction with this person. What are you supposed to be doing? Now, here is why this is important. And to explain why it's important, here, let me do this. I need to explain something super quick to you, which is that there's this idea that where I think that people are a little bit at a loss, or they can't sort of easily explain, even if they've been in functional working relationships, like they can't understand sort of like, well, what's my benchmark of success? And the benchmark of success usually is that there is some sort of like game plan about how we are going to work together. And the trick of it is that it needs to be negotiated, even if you are have a close affinity with this person. And here's why. Now, as you know, there's a lot of conversation about power differentials, right? So, and there's an understanding about sort of just trying to take that sensitivity into consideration. And if you're really going to talk about this, I'm going to take you like 2 minutes through this entire social theory, but I'm going to apply it to sort of what goes on for mentors and mentees. So there were these two psychologists in the 20th century. Their names were John French and Bertram Raven. They basically were looking at sort of how individuals and groups function, or they don't function, by really trying to group sort of different types of power. And so basically what they said is that you can take every single form of power when you're thinking about power differentials, and you can break it down into 6 categories. And so I'm going to walk you through them, and then we're going to actually apply it to sort of like a student/mentor relationship and sort of understand like how this ends up being problematic. So Bertram and Raven argued that there are these 6 forms of power, and we're going to go through we're going to go quickly around it, which is that there's legitimate, reference, expertise, reward, coercive, and information. And what it means is this: that legitimate power is this idea that says that you have the formal authority to make demands or expect others' compliance. As the mentor, you get to decide, or even as a supervisor or as the leader, you get to basically require certain performance or conduct from another person. A second form of power is referent power, as in you are already known as the nurse midwife. The person who you are talking with is not the mentee, the protege. And because there's that difference, that you sort of have more power simply because people in the field know you. The third is expertise. You know more than this person around this particular skill set. The fourth and fifth are our ability to reward and coerce, which means that you have the ability, by virtue of your position, to require or to ask somebody to do something, and also to deny them information. And in this case, particularly for your mentorship relationship, it could be something like time, or your expertise, or your knowledge. And then the final part, the final kind of concept is information, which is that you also have the ability to sort of tell them things like, well, this is sort of the stage that you're going into. This is sort of how you navigate your first year. This is sort of how you basically navigate this situation. Now, here's why you care about this. You can kind of think of this like a power rainbow. And the main thing that you can start to see if you're looking at what is a mentor slash mentee or mentor protege relationship is that every form of power is on the side of the mentor. Right? So because they have either the title, if they're part of an academic institution, they have the tenure or the tenure at the organization, they have the reputation, they have the expertise, they have access usually to resources, or they know more about them. They, in some cases, have the ability, if it's an employment situation, to hire, promote, or fire. But if it's a mentoring relationship, that what the mentor has is the opportunity to do things like to give a letter of recommendation, to advance someone, to sponsor them, to say, you should come and talk with and meet this person. You also have just ideas around kind of power around sort of recommendations and access. But the main thing you just need to recognize is that you have, as is that the mentor by default has every single form of power. And what that looks like is that if something happens, so say in this, for example, I do a training for the F&Ps in the School of Nursing, and when they start, before they start their preceptorships. And what it looks like is this. So say you're in a relationship or you're in a preceptorship, and your preceptor basically comes to the midpoint and it says, you know, you're not meeting expectations. So that's like 5 minutes of their time. And then there's everything that the mentee or the protege or the preceptee has to do to basically try to balance that. Right? So they're going to have to do things like they might actually ask for a consult from an ally. They may actually check in with their department. They may check in with their advisor. They may actually also reach out to somebody else who works in the organization. They may actually sort of engage in check in with my office about sort of how do you have a challenging professional conversation, or the ombuds to have a coaching conversation. They may actually try to protect themselves in sort of deciding things like, well, I have funding, and so if this doesn't go well, you know, even if I had to like redo the quarter, it wouldn't be too harmful, which very few people can say. Or coercion, as in, you know what, I don't necessarily need this letter of recommendation from this person. I don't need it. And the final thing is that they basically might also need information, as in that maybe there was previous feedback given through email or in person, and the person kept notes. But the main point is this, is that when you look at what a power differential is, it has a lot to do with sort of how much time and energy do you have to basically engage in to protect yourself and your interests. It's the difference between a preceptor being able to say in 5 minutes, you're not meeting expectation, and a preceptee basically having to take 5 weeks to engage in all of these activities to make this relationship work. Now, here is why this matters, because one of the things that a number of people are doing, including this program, is entirely the smart thing to do, right? Which is to take out the preceptor kind of aspect of it and to solidly have a mentoring relationship. But if you look at the forms of power, even if you take that away, so you are not necessarily formally evaluating them, you still have the power. And the problem with that is that when mentors or the person who has more of power in the relationship doesn't necessarily kind of acknowledge it, in terms of when you think about sort of bringing your full self to work as a form of inclusivity, that one of the things that you acknowledge is that you have this power. That when you don't do that, the person who's junior in the relationship spends extra time trying to figure out the dynamics of your relationship. And so what mentors do to try to balance that out is they try to actually be transparent about how we're going to work together, about what the expectations are, about sort of how to actually sort of handle certain situations. And the mentee then actually has a higher level of sort of psychological safety and trust that actually it's a good and it's a functional relationship, that they understand how they need to perform. That when we talk about this idea of belonging, it's that I understand how to navigate this environment. And one of the things that's kind of a challenge is that when there's sometimes an affinity between the person who's the mentor and the mentee, that the mentor basically sort of rightfully kind of makes additional accommodations for the junior person in the relationship. So they actually kind of know, and then they push out more information. You need to know this. Oh, you know what, that happened? Let me explain this to you. And that is fantastic. But there's this sense that that you need to sort of think about, well, what are our benchmarks of success in the first 10%? And so if you buy that theory, which it is a theory, it kind of means something obvious. It means that when there's this interesting article by the Harvard Business Review, which they're calling it efficient mentorship, but basically what it says is that mentoring, while mentoring brings purpose and satisfaction, it can be draining. And while there's a lot of literature that focuses on mentorship strategies about the how, the why, the where, the what, the who, that the strategies to sort of think about how to save time and energy are often overlooked. And one of the primary strategies is actually setting up the relationship. Because whenever you have a power differential, there needs to be a negotiation. Negotiation, as some of you may know, comes from the Latin negotium, which means not leisure. It literally means work. That you're going to actually kind of engage in this really meaningful, sort of thoughtful work to actually get your person up and working about, or up and knowledgeable about how to work with you. And so if you understand that, then you need to know that there's sort of 5 things that just need to, that kind of like hurdles that you need to clear to kind of get your mentee up to speed. Or if you're a mentee, that you need to basically try to figure out how to pull out of the mentor, because that kind of gets you to the point that you're ready to have a conversation. One is about the scope, including your goals, their boundaries, and preferences, work style preferences, and we're going to talk about that. The second is communication. So for that lovely person who was kind of like, so do I email you? Do I email you more often? I mean, is that okay? Right? Like those are entirely the questions that you need to ask because you're trying to understand the dynamics of the relationship. The third is when you do meet, what are the expectations about sort of how you all are supposed to want to engage with each other? The fourth is the fourth and fifth is about appreciation and conflict. As in, when people are engaged in a mentorship relationship, one of the ways that they kind of close the circuit on sort of thinking that it was successful is that they have an internal definition about like what it means when it feels good. And that can be anything from my mentee actually sort of gave me feedback about an outcome to a situation that we worked on together. And that's sort of how I experienced appreciation. Like, I know that this is worth my time. And then conflict, as in when there's a problem, how do the mentor and mentee actually want to engage? And so these 5 facets are what we're going to spend our time, not just kind of introducing now, but you're going to also continue to think about it, because there's just information in the literature that basically says that if you get past these 5 sort of hurdles, your relationship is strong. So to understand a little bit about scope, because I'm about to actually put you into small groups, you need to understand sort of like the 1 slide history of mentorship. So here it is. So mentor, so mentoring. So there was a guy named Homer. He basically wrote an Odyssey, he wrote an epic poem called the Odyssey, and where this guy named Odysseus went on an Odyssey for 40 years. While he was away, his best friend, Mentor, watched and advised over his son Telemachus from boyhood to adulthood. And so there's the general kind of idea, the initial idea. Oh, and by the way, that advice was really solid because supposedly it came from the goddess Athena. So like the advice was always good. But the main thing that you need to understand about the relationship is that in that context, it was very much a personal relationship, right? Mentor loved Telemachus. He loved Odysseus. But it's this interesting thing when you talk about mentorship, about weaving in between sort of the personal and the professional and what the norms are. But in general, a mentor is a person who positively influences a protege or mentee's personal, academic, professional, spiritual, whatever development. And a mentor's entire focus, their singular focus is my protege making progress towards their own goals? Now here is usually people are like, yep, I get that. But where people are sort of have questions is understanding that there are generally considered 10 benefits to mentors. So their access to so mentors can potentially give access to resources, access to opportunities, time and attention, emotional support, role modeling or inspiration, advice and direction, skill development. So you'll teach sort of like a technical or a clinical skill. They give access to their network. They can give references or letters of recommendation. And the 10th is that they give protection. And in fact, the original concept behind mentor-mentee was not mentor and mentee, it was mentor-protege. coming from the French and the Latin, right, which is to protect, protegere, because mentors were supposed to protect mentees, and mentees that went out and said that I am whatever, I am Janae Smith's mentee, they wouldn't say that they're a mentee, they would say that I am her protege, understood that there was a protection that was offered there. And this, when we talk about that psychological safety, and feeling as if you're in an environment that is supportive, that this is sort of one of the key pieces. But what's interesting about it is that not that even though think of these as kind of like minerals or vitamins and minerals, that the idea is that a mentee or a protege needs all 10 of them. Mentors, all of us have different preferences about which of these that we want to give, which of these that feel more comfortable to us, which of these that we actually want to engage in, and which ones are uncomfortable. For example, one of the things that, at least in my cohort, one of the things that we sort of saw was that there was a split between the mentors who were able to sit and offer emotional support. So a trainee might have gone through a really difficult day, and the mentee was like, "Oh my gosh, that must have been just so hard for you. What was that like for you? How was, what was, and then what happened, and then what happened?" And some of our mentors were really uncomfortable with that, and they went straight to skill development. Okay, well, let me tell you my story about sort of how I handled this, and let's just keep going, right? And so for the mentee who wanted this space, who had this unenforceable rule that this mentoring relationship would be one where they would say, get this quote unquote emotional support, and the mentor who had the best of intentions, that they sort of missed